All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Xiomara Chavez, and I'm the lead project manager for Communities in Charge. Thank you so much for joining us today for the cost reimbursement webinar. Next slide. Okay. So from the attendee experience, you are in webinar mode. So that means you have the option to chat anything in the box, lower your hand if you would like to say something. We will not be answering questions all the way till the Q&A, so we can reserve the lowering and the bringing up your hand and putting it down at that time. And then if you have any questions at any time, feel free to put them in the Q&A section, and then we can address them towards the end of our presentation as well. So be sure that all of your functions for audio are in good working order to be able to hear the rest of the presentation. But that's all for Zoom logistics. Next slide. Okay, so today we're going to do just a bit of introductions, a little bit of program overview, but then we'll really get into the meat and potatoes of this webinar, which is understanding the incentive recipient agreements that will be that you will receive in short order, cost eligibility overview and additional considerations, the walkthrough of the incentive processing center, and then how to submit midpoint or final payment invoices, and then a timeline for final payments, and then just a list of acronyms for your reference, and then Q&A. Next slide. Okay, so Communities in Charge is a team effort. We, CalSTART, are the implementer, and we are funded by the California Energy Commission, and they are here joining us as well. So thank you, Phil, Brian, and Danielle for joining us today. Grid Alternatives is our equity and outreach partner, and we also have Tetra Tech, who graciously processes all of your applications and in short order your invoices. So thank you all so much for joining us and being a part of this awesome team. Next slide. Okay, so just a brief overview. Communities in Charge is a market accelerating light duty EV charging incentive project for level 2 EV charging stations. As mentioned earlier, we are funded by the California Energy Commission Clean Transportation Program, and it's implemented by us, the project team, and there was 30 million available for the first funding wave. Next slide. Okay, so for this cost reimbursement webinar, we choose to, by the end of it, y'all should be able to understand cost reimbursement policies, be able to navigate the reimbursement system effectively through the incentive processing center, and enhance your skills in documenting expenses for reimbursements. Next slide. Okay, and just a quick disclaimer, the content contained herein are examples provided for informational purposes to aid overall participation in Communities in Charge incentive projects. None of the information contained herein shall be considered financial advice. Please verify your expenses with your accounting team. Next slide. Okay, so first things first, let's go over the incentive recipient agreement. Next slide. Okay, so the incentive recipient agreement is an agreement between the awardee organization, so you and CalSTART, before submitting a payment request. The agreement outlines all expectations, eligibility requirements, duties, and responsibilities that awardees must comply with, and this also includes the terms and conditions. If you are unable to execute the incentive recipient agreement, you will not be eligible to receive funding from Communities in Charge. The person, and then the next question is like, who signed the IRA? The organization's authorized signatory is the proper party to execute the agreement. I believe we have all of those on record for now. And yeah, so we have those confirmed. So they will be the one signing the incentive recipient agreement. And then these will be distributed directly to awardees to their email on record in the IPC. So be sure to check your email and check the IPC to ensure that your email is correct. And then the awardee will execute the agreement by e-signature and then return it to CalSTART. Next slide. Okay, so let's go over cost eligibilities, what is in and what is out. Next slide. Okay, so here's a list of all of the different eligible project costs for communities in charge. And of course, for a complete list, please check the implementation manual. And so for sure, everything that's eligible is EVSE or electric vehicle supply equipment, transformers that are needed to bring power to the site, electric panels that are needed to also bring power to the building or area, and then any installation costs, so materials and labor, the network agreements. So what's going to be able to, keep your charger online with the EV network provider. So this is like, for example, and no preference, like someone like ChargePoint or EVgo, even though they mostly do DC fast charge, but the network itself. And then extended warranty, including operation and maintenance contracts. Any stub outs that you decide to install for any future EVSE, and then design, engineering, and utility service costs, any upgrades needed for ADA compliance, and then demand management equipment. Next slide. So ineligible project costs, things that you will not be able to get reimbursed for, is compensation for the work associated in completing the required application process, any upgrades to utility-owned electrical infrastructure, and then any fees paid to AHJs, authority having jurisdictions, also known like City Hall, for permits, and then any costs to fund standalone energy generation, like solar panels, and then costs associated with bringing a site into compliance with California state or US federal building codes, including ADA, which are not directly associated with the level 2 EVSEs installed. And just to remind everyone that any project costs that were incurred before December 23 of the year 2022 are not eligible and cannot be reimbursed for the project. Next slide. Okay, so I believe the cost definitions portion will be led by my colleague, Patricia Mulberry. Thanks, Patricia.
Thanks, Theo. Hi, everyone. My name is Patricia. I am a project manager 1 on the Communities in Charge team. I will be going over the cost definitions, prevailing wage requirements, and the EVITP requirements. Next slide, please. So we will begin with our cost definition. So first we'll go over our direct costs, which are allowable costs incurred that can be attributed to a specific final cost object. An example of this includes labor paid at prevailing wage can be a direct cost. Incurred costs are invoice costs to the applicant for planning, installation, construction, and deployment of level 2 EVSE infrastructure at an eligible project site shall be considered incurred costs. The invoice date for said cost shall serve as the date on which the costs were incurred. The date on which the invoice was paid shall not serve as the date on which the costs were incurred. This is incredibly important to remember as you're submitting for midpoint and or final payment, just pay attention to the invoice date. It needs to be when the costs were actually occurred and not when it was paid. So an example of this, it's going to be your equipment cost for EVSE invoice to the applicant can be the incurred costs. Some other definitions can be fringe benefits, which are applied to direct labor. Rate is derived by taking the total salaries and wages divided by the total fringe benefits. Direct labor is going to be directly benefits the program and performed by the awardee or the employee of the organization. Next slide, please. And here we've just included a couple examples of our direct costs and our fringe benefits. So for direct costs, that's going to include personnel costs, your subcontractor, capital cost, project management, equipment costs, and network costs. For fringe benefits, that's going to be paid time off, statutory benefits, and healthcare. G&A and indirect are not considered direct costs and are therefore ineligible for reimbursement under communities in charge. Next slide, please. All right, so this is a really big requirement. So it's going to be compliance with prevailing wage. So all participants in communities in charge shall comply with all portions of the California prevailing wage law. So under prevailing wage requirements in California, all workers employed on public works project must be paid the prevailing wage determined by the Department of Industrial Relations according to the type of work and the location of the project. In order to comply with DIR, it needs to be a public works project. So your first question might be, well, is my project public works? So as defined by the Department of Industrial Relations, public works means constructions, alternation, demolition, installation, or repair work done under contract and paid in whole or in part out of public funds. It can be included pre-construction, post-construction activities related to a public works project. And you definitely recommend reviewing the labor code for, I apologize for that. My apologies. Anyone working on a public works project must be paid prevailing wages as determined by DIR. Projects of 30,000 or more must meet DIR's apprenticeship requirements. Failure to comply with public works requirements can result in civil penalties, criminal prosecution, or both. Definitely recommend reviewing the labor code and the DIR website. Both of them are very helpful resources. Next slide, please. All right, and this brings us to our EVITP requirements. So under communities in charge, all awardees must use EVITP certified electricians for the installation of the level 2 EVSEs according to the following requirements. Just kind of essentially, if the EVSEs charging ports supplying 24.9 kilowatts or less, that's going to require at least one EVITP certified electrician be on site during working hours at all times. Now, if the EVSE being installed supports at least one or more, and it's supplying 25 kilowatts or more, at least 25% of the total electricians on site need to be EVITP certified. Next slide, please. All right, and I will pass it on over to Jeff. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Patricia. My name is Jeff. I'm the Deputy Director for Light Duty EV Infrastructure Incentive Administration here at CalSTART, and I am happy to guide you through a next fairly large chunk of things here on our presentation. Just wanted to call a couple things out that Trish mentioned. Do pay close attention to a couple of the links that will be provided in the slides once they are distributed pertaining to prevailing wage compliance as well as compliance with EVITP. All right, let's move it along to the next slide, please. So navigating the Incentive Processing Center, this is the main point of contact that you will be using to submit your payment requests. As a reminder, submitting a midpoint or final payment may only be done by awardees who have executed their incentive recipient agreement, and all payment requests must be accompanied by the payment request form and must be submitted through the Incentive Processing Center or IPC. No submissions via email, phone, or other avenue will be honored. Next slide. So let's navigate in brief the Incentive Processing Center pursuant to submitting a payment request. So to submit a payment request, you will first need to log into your account on the IPC. Once you are logged in, select the Payment Requests tab at the top, as is illustrated in box number 1, step 1. From the Payment Requests tab, click Request Payment, as is illustrated in the center box on this slide. Awardees must select the appropriate award, which corresponds to the project site for which they are submitting a request for payment. As is indicated on the third box, select whether this is a midpoint payment or a final payment, bearing in mind that incentive payouts associated with a midpoint payment shall not exceed 50% of the amount of an awardee's magnitude of award for that project site. Then you'll input the total amount associated with the invoices submitted with this payment request. For instance, if the total costs associated with this payment request are $50,000, enter $50,000 in that box. You'll then click Save and Continue. Next slide. This brings us to step 4. At this point, you'll double check that you have entered all your information correctly before continuing. The award selected, payment type, so midpoint or final, and total invoice amount should reflect the project site award for which you are requesting payment, the type of payment request being made, midpoint or final, and the amount of total invoiced costs associated with this request. To save your information and advance to the next step, you'll press Save and Continue in blue. Next slide. Moving along to step 5, you'll confirm whether, as of the time of your payment request, construction has begun at the project site. For those submitting a request for midpoint payment, construction is not required to have commenced at the time a midpoint payment request is made. For those submitting a request for final payment, construction not only must have completed, but you are required to provide details on the installation professionals at your project site on subsequent screens. We'll get into that in a moment. You'll save your information here and advance to the next step by clicking Save and Continue. Next slide. Moving on to step 6. This step must be completed by all those submitting a request for final payment, so those who have begun or completed construction. The first name, last name, and identification details must be submitted for the general contractor and EVITP technicians on site. These details include the contractor's state licensing board number, or CSLB number, of the general contractor on site, and the Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Training Program number, or EVITP number, of all EVITP certified technicians used during the completion of the site. Once this has been entered, and to advance to the next step, you'll press Save and Continue. Next slide. Moving on to step 7. At this juncture, you are asked to upload all supporting documentation to substantiate costs incurred associated with your payment request. If submitting a request for midpoint payment, you'll only need to upload the applicable invoices for which reimbursement is being requested. Documents must include, for those submitting a final payment, but shall not be limited to, photos of all installed equipment, including photos of serialized chargers with the serial number clearly visible and legible in the photo, a copy of the paid and executed network agreement or contract, a copy of the final inspection card from the appropriate authority having jurisdiction, or AHJ, and final payment invoices with the invoice date. We will go into further detail about documentation to substantiate incurred costs later on in the presentation. To save your uploaded documents and advance to the next step, you'll click Save and Continue in the bottom in blue. Next slide. Step 8. This next step is only required for those submitting a request for final payment. For every EVSE that is receiving incentives, please provide its unique serial number. Serial numbers may be found on the EVSE itself and sometimes may be found on the equipment invoice or bill of materials provided by the supplier. Once you have entered all the serial numbers of your EVSEs and wish to advance to the next step, you will click Save and then Continue. Next slide. Moving on to step 9, almost there. Before finalizing your request for payment, please be sure that all information is true, accurate, and correct, everything which you have submitted thus far. All payment requests must be processed and approved by Communities in Charge staff prior to incentives being dispersed. In the event your payment request is rejected, you may submit a support request to rectify any issues with your previously submitted payment request. For instance, if it is missing a document or something is illegible, your payment request may be delayed or rejected, and you'll be provided guidance as to how to rectify that through a support request. If everything is looking good and you are ready to submit your request for payment, you'll click Submit Payment in blue. You will not be able to make changes to the request once you have submitted. Next slide. And step 10 is less of a step than it is a confirmation. Upon submission of your payment request, you will see this confirmation screen indicating your payment request was submitted successfully. You may revisit the payment request tab of your IPC account at any time and review the status of your payment request. Once your payment request has been verified as complete and valid, all of the necessary documentation has been included and verified, incentive funds are normally dispersed within 15 business days and shall be sent via paper check to the address associated with your account. Next slide. Okay, now we're going to get into a little bit of invoice submission accompanying a midpoint or final payment. Next slide. Awardees must complete their project and submit their request for final payment no later than 270 calendar days from receipt of their notice of final award. If you are submitting for a request for midpoint payment, as a reminder, midpoint payments shall not exceed 50% of an awardee's magnitude of award. For instance, if you have a magnitude of award of 14,000, you are submitting for midpoint payments, the maximum that would be paid out through that midpoint payment is therefore 7,000. As for submitting proper documentation, please bear in mind the following bulleted considerations. Invoices must include the invoice date and an itemization of eligible costs, credits, discounts, and any incentives received from other programs as applicable. You must also have a signed copy of the job site installation form, certifying your compliance with prevailing wage requirements and compliance with EVITP. Also include a signed final inspection card, a signed copy of your paid and executed network agreement form, and photos of installed equipment, including photos of serialized chargers with serial numbers clearly visible and legible in each of the photos. Next slide. A payment request form must be submitted with every request for payment. Communities in Charge will make the midpoint/final payment request form available on its website here shortly. And Communities in Charge will ensure that this is available for you to download and fill out in association with any of your requests for midpoint or final payment. Next slide. The payment request form includes a summary of incurred costs, such as direct labor, fringe benefits, equipment, materials and miscellaneous, and subcontractor costs. As a reminder, G&A and indirect are not considered direct costs and are therefore ineligible for reimbursement under communities in charge. Next slide. So now that we've gone through the process of requesting a midpoint or final payment, the steps to do so through the Incentive Processing Center or IPC, and some important considerations when providing supporting documentation, there are a few reminders which bear repeating. The midpoint and or final payment form must be completed by the awardee when submitting for payment reimbursement. This is for either a midpoint or a final payment. Failure to complete the form properly or within a timely manner may result in non-payment. Final payment requests and all supporting documentation must be submitted within 270 calendar days from our notice of final award. Next slide. So I mentioned earlier, we'll get into some important considerations with respect to invoicing, and here they are. So proof of an incurred direct labor costs shall include the costs incurred within the period eligible for incurring those costs, so not prior to the date which Xiomara mentioned earlier. Labor hours supported by time records, documentation supporting those labor rates, and payroll registers. Proof of direct incurred equipment costs must include the itemization or itemized listing of equipment billed, the amounts billed supported by your vendor invoices, receipts, or other relevant documentation from a third party, for instance. Documentation supporting ownership, such as a title, if applicable. Copies of canceled checks to show proof of payment, and any other documents deemed relevant or requested by the project team. Next slide. Some further invoicing requirements. Proof of incurred other costs shall include an itemized listing of those other direct costs we mentioned and the amounts billed. Amounts billed supported by vendor invoices, receipts, or other third-party documentation, and any copies of canceled checks or bank statement to show proof of payment. Finally, around burden rates or fringe benefit shall include one of the following: rates supported by methodology in which rates are derived and applied, and we have a sample calculation formula there, total benefit cost pool divided by the total labor costs. Next slide. So we've gotten into a lot of detail around what is expected, when it is expected. Let's take a brief moment to zoom out and take a look at an overall timeline for final payment. Next slide. The stylized timeline illustrated here provides a high-level overview of a payment request. Once an awardee receives their notice of final award, they must sign their incentive recipient agreement. At this point, they may submit a request for midpoint payment and must submit their request for final payment no later than 270 calendar days following their receipt of their notice of final award. Requests for extension beyond the timeline described above will be considered, and awardees may submit a request for extension through the Incentive Processing Center. All requests must be made in accordance with the extensions policy published on the Communities in Charge website. Next slide. Finally, a few acronyms to help support. Next slide. We've included them here as they may be helpful during subsequent reviews of this slide deck. So IPC, our Incentive Processing Center. We have EVITP, the Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Training Program. California Department of Industrial Relations, DIR, and the Incentive Recipient Agreement we have shorthanded a few times in here as IRA. Now, to guide us through our Q&A period, I will hand it back over to Chris.
Thank you, Jeff. Hello, everyone, and good day. My name is Chris Alvera. I am a project manager over here at CalStart, and I'll be helping out with the Q&A session today for our PowerPoint presentation. Hope everyone's doing good today. A few Q&A guidelines. These are for people possibly on cell phones, anyone on regular web, web browsers, have your hand raised, things around those lines. Just a few instructions. Please state your name once you raise your hand. Keep questions about under 3 minutes and allow others to ask questions as well. We are going to vent some of the chat questions first. I believe the only one that was popping up was, will these slides be emailed to those who registered for the webinar? Yes, they will. After the webinar is complete, we have a list of attendees and this will be sent out to all of y'all, so no worries about that. In that sense, it looks like that's the only one thus far, but feel free to go ahead and start asking me questions that you guys may have about any of this, and we'll go from there. Okay. We have a question from Marlo. Please re-explain the difference between the invoice date and incurred cost difference.
This is Jeff. I'm happy to field that. Yeah, thank you for your question there, Marlo. The difference between an invoice date and an incurred cost, the date that is visible on an invoice provided to us shall be the date at which costs are considered to have been incurred. So for instance, if you're providing an invoice that says, here are these costs, and the date of that invoice is August 30th, the date at which those costs were incurred shall be considered to be August 30th.
Thank you, Jeff. A question, when do applications open?
I can take that one. Thanks, Chris. So the applications for the funding wave 1 for communities in charge has been closed since May 8th of this year. We will be opening a new funding wave in Q4 of 2023, but for today we will be only answering questions about cost reimbursement for funding wave 1. Thank you for your question.
Thank you, Sia. This one comes from Sam. Oops, sorry. Oh, it looks like it's, there we go. Now we got some movement going. Sam asks, let's see, what types of properties are eligible? Commercial, multifamily, single housing?
Yes, this is Jeff. Happy to answer that. So there are a number of properties which are eligible, whether they be commercial, multifamily. The one that you have called out there as in single family homes are not eligible project sites as listed on our implementation manual, but any locations at which level 2 EV chargers may be installed, the few preclusions, for instance, installations for school bus charging are ineligible for incentives. Single family detached homes, or as well as just single points of residence, are not eligible project sites. However, all other level 2 project sites are eligible. I would encourage you to take a look through the explicitly ineligible project sites described in the implementation manual just for further precise details.
Thank you, Jeff. At what event/milestone is an individual project regarded and no longer an active CEC funding project?
This is Jeff. I can answer that. If you have completed the project site, meaning, for instance, you are participating, or rather had participated in a CEC funded EV charging project, and you have since completed construction, that site has been energized and commissioned, that would no longer be regarded as an active CEC funded project. So If there's any other further context, I'm going to hold a little bit of space here just to make sure that anyone from the Energy Commission can chime in and offer up any further context on that, since we do thankfully have them on the line today.
This is Phil from Energy Commission. No, I think that makes sense, Jeff. It's we don't want another project underway that's co-funded or could be co-funded at the same time by CEC.
Thank you both. Next one. For step 6, does our general contract need to be a B license or C10?
Hi, Marlo. This is Jeff. I can answer your question here. Regarding the general contractor licensure level, this is something that you would need to double check with any of the prevailing rules, regulations, and codes that might have limitations on a particular level of licensure that is necessary for a site. Typically, this has to do with the scale and scope of the site. So I would have you consult with your appropriate authority having jurisdiction to ensure that the licensure for the general contractor you are intending to use is adequate for the site.
Thank you, Jeff. Are the additions of sub-outs over and above the funded connectors are eligible reimbursable cost items as match?
So sorry, team, I was talking there on mute. My apologies. Byron, so your question on the addition of stub outs over and above the funded connectors, this would be a similar case as to where if you have additional connectors that you wish to be installed above the maximums described in the program design, they may count toward total eligible costs. However, incentives will only be issued for connectors that meet project requirements.
Thank you, Jeff. Marlo, it was mentioned we need proof of payment with bank statements. Is this for the final payment or midpoint payment?
In terms of proof of payment, I might pass this over to, we have one of the folks in our accounting department here, Rick. Rick, might you be able to share some best practices here with respect to proof of payment, and then I can fill in any blanks there, color in between the lines programmatically.
Sure. Hi. Yes, I'm Rick Bautista, Senior Accountant at CalStart. With respect to proof of payment, canceled check would suffice. We don't need an entire bank statement, but yeah, canceled check would suffice. But with respect to when, mid, or final payment, I'll leave that up to Jeff.
Yes, and thank you. As for the canceled check to provide proof of payment, at any time where proof of payment is being requested, if you are submitting a midpoint payment, later on submitting a final payment, or only submitting a final payment, we will need to see that for either of the, anytime you're submitting for a request for reimbursement, we'll need to see proof of payment.
Thank you both for answering those questions, and everyone else as well too. Feel free to go ahead and, oh, we have another one. Thank you, Miguel. What happens if your pay invoice is using a credit card?
So this might be another one, Rick. I might pull you in here just in terms of the best means of showing proof of payment if the payment is made using, let's say, a company credit card.
Sure. Yeah, in that case, if you paid via credit card, then we would need to see the credit card statement. And if you don't want us to see other expenses in the credit card statement, you're free to redact the other items. And that's it.
Thank you, Rick.
I see Byron Washam's hand up. Byron, do you have questions? I can go ahead and unmute you.
Okay, thank you very much. Before I start, I just want to congratulate the entire team for probably the most efficient and painless solicitation process I've ever been through with the CEC. It was clear, and our results clearly reflected the speed by which you were able to evaluate these projects. So I give you a big kudo. Another question that I have is, does the property of the equipment vest at any time with the CalSTART or CEC, or does it vest with the grantee once they pay their invoice?
Byron, you broke up a little bit there for me, and
Okay.
it was after, does the property vest? And maybe you could go back over that one more time.
Sure. Sorry. At what time does the property vest with the grantee? Is it when the grantee pays the invoice, or to put it another way, at any time does CalSTART or the CEC take title of the property equipment?
Okay, thank you for your question. Yeah, so it sounds like it has to do with ownership schema here. Does at any point the ownership transfer to the Energy Commission, or does it perhaps transfer to CalSTART, or neither of those two? So neither CalSTART nor the Energy Commission, and I will have the Energy Commission kind of correct me if this is inaccurate, neither CalSTART nor the Energy Commission have documentation set up such that we would necessarily take ownership over equipment that would receive incentives from a particular block grant. But I'll hold a little bit of space here to make sure that that is accurate.
Yeah, you're correct, Jeff. The equipment vests with the recipient of the equipment.
Okay. I see Byron, you have your hand up. Let me go ahead and do Miguel, because I believe he was in the chat first, and then we'll get to you, sir. Miguel Martinez, if you pay multiple invoices from one vendor with one credit card payment, do you have to show which invoices were paid by one credit card payment?
This is Jeff. I can provide a little bit of clarity here. So this is a good question, Miguel. Thank you for asking. And it sounds like multiple invoices showing up as essentially one charge on a particular credit card statement. For this, we would, of course, need to see that credit card statement, and for best practices to keep everything clean, if possible, we recommended that those be separated out into separate charges. However, if there is any specific guidance for verification that Energy Commission would like to weigh in on here, please feel free to offer up. And maybe I'll pass it over to, oh, go ahead, Phil.
I'll take this one, Jeff. I think, just understand it needs to be auditable documentation. So that's why there is a bulleted list, and we need to be able to, if at any time needed, request that backup documentation.
Excellent. Thank you, Danielle. So I think the name of the game here is very good record keeping will pay dividends in the long run.
Okay, thank you all. Byron, it looks like you have your hand up. Let me go ahead and unmute you.
Okay, thank you. As I understand it, if this equipment is installed before January 1, 2024, it need not have a credit card reader on it, and nor do you need to have a payment kiosk for those individuals who might not have a smartphone. Can you maybe clarify what your requirements are for a credit card reader or a payment kiosk?
This is Jeff. I'm happy to offer up some support there, Byron, and then I believe that the Energy Commission might be able to speak to this from more an agency perspective. So the programmatic requirements as it pertains to credit card readers are really to just be in compliance with any of the prevailing laws, regulations that might otherwise impact the requirement to have credit card readers or near field communication. The recommendation that we can provide at this time is just ensure that you are following state laws. I believe it was SB 123 which removed the credit card reader requirement. So I would take another look at that just to make sure that any equipment which you are seeking to install or will be installed on or after January 1 of 2024 is going to be in compliance. I'll hold a little bit of space here just to see if our partners over at the Energy Commission have any other context to offer up. Okay, looks like we nailed it then.
Thanks, Jeff. Byron, thank you for your questions, and everyone, thank you for the questions as well. Feel free to drop any more in the Q&A chat box. We'll answer them the best way we can. Okay, I'll go ahead and still leave this open just for a little bit, but if you all do have any questions, feel free to go to our website and we'll be able to facilitate those as well over there. But I'll still leave this open just for a minute or two longer, just in case you do have any. But like I said, if something comes to you later, no worries, you can always go to our website and ask those questions, and we'll be happy to answer them to you. So I'll just leave this open for just about a minute longer. Okay, I'll go ahead and go to the next slide here. So the communities in charge, we have some, well, an important upcoming date. As Xiomara already mentioned, Funding Wave 1 has closed, but in Q4 2023, Funding Wave 2 is going to be opening up. We will give you more details as time goes on as far as like specific dates, things around those lines, but stay tuned for fun stuff. And we would like to thank you all for joining us on this Wednesday. Maybe some of you guys are in afternoon or still in the morning, but thank you all for your positive feedback, your questions, and just yeah, thank you everyone for coming and chit-chatting with us and joining us this morning. If there are no further questions, I'll go ahead and call this to close, and everyone can go. Oh, looks like we have. Oh, thank you all so much for joining us. Sorry, CEO, no problem. I'll go ahead and stop sharing. And once again, thanks everyone.